1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 8. Now, brothers and sisters, I want you to remember the good news I told you. You received that good news message and you continue to base your life on it. That good news, the message you heard from me, is God's way to save you. But you must continue believing it. If you don't, you believe for nothing. I gave you the message that I received. I told you the most important truths. That one, Christ died for our sins, as the scriptures say. 2, he was buried. 3, he was raised to life on the third day, as the scriptures say. And 4, he appeared to Peter and then to the 12 apostles. After that, Christ appeared to more than 500 other believers at the same time. Most of them are still living today, but some have died. Then he appeared to James and later to all the apostles. Last of all, he appeared to me. I was different, like a baby born before the normal time. All right, so basically these are the most important truths from Paul's mindset. And we're looking at this from the point of view that Christianity is not a faith, but basically it's a fact. It's a truth, like Paul says. And those facts are the object of our faith. But Christianity itself is the fact that God exists and he sent his son Jesus into the earth because we were sinners, and Jesus died for our sins. He was buried, he was raised, historically speaking, and he rose from a historical point of view, and he appeared to a lot of people who saw and verified those historical facts, which basically show us that Christianity is a fact, that God exists, he sent his son to die for our sins, and the only aspect where faith comes in is that now, because of these facts, we believe what Jesus says about the future, which is that if you trust him to forgive you, your future will be in heaven. That's where faith comes in. But the foundation of our faith is facts. And so, first point is that there's a God. Now, obviously, there's people who don't really believe that there's a God, and then there's Christians who struggle with knowing that there's a God. But the truth of the matter is that there's only 3 views. You can be an atheist and say that there was no God, that nothing is the source of all existence, and nothing created the universe and nothing created life. That's the atheist view. Another atheist view is to say that the universe was always here and the universe created life. The third only option is that God was always here and God created the universe and then he also created life. These are the only 3 ways you can think about it. There's either nothing was in the beginning nothing, or in the beginning universe, or in the beginning God. All right, so now what do Christians mean when they use the word God? Well, the basic understanding of the word God is that he's a being who is spaceless, which means he doesn't take up space. He's immaterial, which means he's not made of matter or energy, because matter and energy is basically the same thing, 2 sides of the same coin. When you have matter, you have to have energy to keep the matter intact, so to speak. And so matter and energy is pretty much the same thing. And when we say God, we mean timeless, which means that he doesn't change, and therefore his existence does not require time. That's what we mean also when we say spirit. Spirit is a spaceless, immaterial, timeless being, a conscious being. And also when we say God, we're talking about the source of existence. So these are like the basic bare bones skeleton definitions of God, and so the source means this is where all things came from. The universe is a resource. Our life is a resource because we came from our parents. Our parents' life is a resource because they came from their parents. Everything that comes from something is a resource. but ultimately resources come from a source that never came from anything. And so that's what we talk about when we say God. Spirit is a mental being, basically something that's not physical. It's a conscious being, and which means that it doesn't have a body, but it has the ability to think. It's aware of its surroundings. That's what we mean by physical, and that's what we mean by spirit. I mean, universe in theology means one spoken sentence. Uni is one spoken sentence, is a verse. In Genesis 1:1, God spoke in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth. So that's the sentence for universe. Where did the universe come from? It came from the words of God. Now in science, the word universe refers to everything that's physical. If you take all the physical things, all the matter, all the energy, all the space, all the time, that's what we call the universe in science. And so even when you say the word multiverse, technically you can simplify it by saying universe, because the multiverse is still a combination of physical things. And so the word universe basically just means everything physical. All right, so it's important to understand these definitions when we're laying out these facts about the existence of God. Nothing means no thing. It's a compound word, no thing. So when you say nothing created the universe, you're saying no thing created the universe, which obviously doesn't make sense. Nothing means not something. It's the absence of a thing, which means that it has no properties, so it can't create in the first place. And it has no abilities, because it's not a it. No thing, nothing, no abilities. So to say that something with no abilities had the ability to create the universe is a contradiction. All right, but that's what we mean when we say nothing. All right, source is where everything came from. So it doesn't make sense to say who made God, because God is, by definition, God, the word God means the source of life, where everything came from. So sources create resources, but sources don't have sources, because if they do, they would be a resource themselves. And so it doesn't make sense to say, where did the source come from? You might as well just say, where did that resource come from? But the question is, what is the source of life? Sources are uncaused, but they themselves cause all things to come into being. Sources are where everything comes from. They are the initial cause that was never made. That's why it's called a source. If it was made, it would be called a resource. It is the starting point of all creation. So it doesn't make sense to say, where does the starter come from? It is the starter. And so a source, by definition, is where all resources come from. A resource is anything that comes from a source. Anything made, anything with a beginning, that's what a resource is. But when we talk about God, we're talking about source. And so it's important to understand that, so we can make things clear. So now, the three views: the nothing view, the infinite universe view, and the God view. All right. Now, the nothing view doesn't make any sense. Unfortunately, it makes no sense. It has logical problems, it has scientific problems. Logically, we already know every effect has to have a cause. So if you have a big bang, that's an effect, and therefore you have to have a cause. That's just basic logic. You can't have effects without causes. And so you can't have a bang without a cause. And so if I ask you, what is the cause of the bang, and you say nothing, that's not logical. Second of all, if you say the cause was nothing, nothing has no properties, like we said already, and therefore it cannot create. If it has no properties, it doesn't have the ability to create. So it's a logical contradiction to say that something with no properties had the property to create the universe, or something with no abilities had the ability to create the universe. That's a contradiction. So that view is illogical. It's already scratched off just by that. But not only is it illogical, but it's not even scientific for a number of reasons. But one of them we'll just mention real quick is the law of biogenesis, that tells you every life form comes from another life form. So living things come from living things. Living things don't come from dead things. That's science. So now in atheism, they have a theory of evolution. And remember, laws are more powerful than theories. And their theory says the first life came from something that was not alive. But that's not scientific, because science tells you the law of biogenesis, life comes from life. Life can't evolve from non-life. Rocks don't have DNA, so they can't produce bacteria. You see? So scientifically, this view is eliminated because you can't have life coming from things that are not alive. And not only that, in science, remember, you have to observe it. So to call it science, you have to be able to show us in a test tube, so to speak, where a rock can produce a living thing, not dead amino acids. We're talking about a living thing. And so until you can show a non-living thing coming into life, you can't call it science. You could call it your philosophy, but you can't call it science, because science has to be observed by everybody else, and it has to be something that can be repeated by everybody else in order for it to be considered science according to the scientific method. If you can't observe it, if you can't repeat it, it's not science. And the law of life coming from life has always been observed, and it can be repeated. But life coming from rocks and rain and lightning has never been observed and has never been repeated, and therefore it can't be called science. So not only can you not call it science, but it also contradicts the law of science of biogenesis. And so this view has logical and scientific problems, and so it's crossed out. Furthermore, Newton's law of motion eliminates this view, because objects at rest remain at rest unless there's an external outside force that changes that. And so if the universe was at first nothing, it would still be nothing. It would stay in that situation until there's a other force that came and created the Big Bang. But if there was nothing there would be no other force to change the nothing into something. And this is all scientific. And so because of the logical problems and the scientific problems, this view is eliminated. So now the atheist has the option of saying, okay, maybe the universe was always here. So obviously it can't come from nothing. So maybe it was always here. Maybe physical things were always here. There was always stars. There was always planets, maybe. And then maybe from those rock planets, life evolved. But maybe the rocks and the planets were always there in space. And problems with this view, scientific, for one, is the law of thermodynamics. Energy runs out. So an infinite universe is impossible. If the universe was always here, the stars would have stopped shining already, because stars are made of energy. Energy runs out. Like a light bulb, if you have a light and you leave the light on for infinity, what happens to the light? It goes off. It runs out of energy. It runs out of steam, whatever you want to say. It runs out, and therefore it dies out. And so all the lights in the universe would have blacked out by now, because infinity is forever. And so if the universe was always here from the past infinity, the universe would have been all black by now. The other problem is that we know that energy is limited. E equals mc squared tells us that. We multiply all the matter in the universe times the speed of light squared, you're going to get a constant number, which means that you don't have an infinite amount of energy in the universe. You have a limited fixed amount of energy, and that amount of energy is contained by the speed of light. And so energy is not infinite, so you can't have an infinite universe. All right? Usable energy is definitely not infinite. Also, the law of biogenesis eliminates this view too, because even if you say the universe was always here, how does life evolve from non-living things? Once again, planets are not made of DNA. Rocks don't have DNA. Lightning doesn't have DNA. Water doesn't have DNA. So you can't combine those things and produce life. All right. So it's unscientific. Also, it's not mathematical. Because when you say the universe was always here, you're saying that the universe is infinite in the past. But infinity is not a real number in math. Infinity is what they call an imaginary number. It's not a real number because it's really just an idea that says keep going. It's not a destination that you reach. And so you can't say the past was infinite because infinity doesn't exist. Infinity is just the idea that says keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. That's all infinity means. Infinity is just another way of saying keep going or add one more. It's not a destination. And so the history of the universe can't be infinite because that would mean the history of the universe doesn't exist. All right. And so math eliminates this view. So not only science eliminates this view, but math eliminates the possibility of a universe that was always here. And that's what that view is eliminated. And so we're only view that we have left is the God view. And so now we got to look to see, okay, if we're left with the God view, what about the logical problems and the scientific problems and the mathematical problems? Don't they also apply to the God view? And the answer is no. Because one, there's nothing illogical about saying God is the source of our existence because everything else needs a resource. If there's a resource, there has to be an ultimate source. There's nothing illogical about that. So to say that God is the source of life and everything else, including the universe, came from Him, there's nothing illogical about that. It's different from saying you have a universe that came from nothing. That's illogical. Nothing doesn't have properties. God has properties. And so that's not illogical to say God created the universe. Now, scientific, is there a problem there? No, because God is a spirit. Matter, if He was made of something physical, He would take up space, He would need energy, and He would require distance, and therefore He would take up time. But because He's a spirit, He doesn't require space, He doesn't require distance, He doesn't take up time. And so, like our thoughts, God is immaterial being, and no changes are taking place with his existence. God is a spirit, therefore He lives outside of time. No matter or space is needed for Him to exist. But just like our thoughts, His spirit has the ability to create physical things and control the physical world that we live in, just like our mind has the ability to create actions through our physical body. And so there's nothing unscientific or illogical about that. Math, there's no mathematical problem because God does not exist infinitely. When we say that God was always there, so to speak, we're not talking in terms of infinity, we're talking in terms of no time. So because God is a spirit, He's not made of matter or energy, He doesn't take up space, He doesn't have to change because He's perfect. So He's a spirit like our thoughts who does not change. Therefore, there's no time because time only happens when there's a change. And so God exists timelessly until He creates the universe by saying, let there be light, so to speak. And now once He speaks, there's a change that takes place. And because there's a change, time starts. And so there's no mathematical problem with saying that there's a spirit that we call God that was always there. And that spirit created the universe that we see today. No math problem, no science problem, no logic problem. All right. So God's existence is a fact. Now, God came to earth in the form of Jesus to die for our sins. That's Christianity. Those are the facts of Christianity. Now, Jesus was crucified, buried, resurrected, appeared. This happened roughly 30 AD. 25 years later, 1 Corinthians is written. 25 years later. Okay? You have 30 AD here. 25 years later, you have the book of 1 Corinthians. Now, some people might say, hey, that's a long time between, that's a long time between, 25 years from the time that Jesus actually died to the time that somebody wrote about him. Maybe that's not accurate history. Now, first of all, remember Paul says he received it. And so it means that he could have been quoting a source that came during the time of the life of Jesus himself. So probably there was no time between the source that Paul is using and the death of Jesus. But even if there was 25 years, let's pretend there was 25 years. You're saying, 25 is not accurate. But if you take that point of view, you have to get rid of all of history. Because, for example, Alexander the Great here was born 356 BC. And the first historian writes about him roughly 300 years later. All right? 300 years later. So if you're going to believe in Alexander the Great, there's no way you can deny the history of Jesus. You see, it's just not historical for you to do that. And so the fact that Alexander the Great is taken to be a historical fact, the life of Alexander the Great, and his life was written about 300 years after his death. 25 years, we have to accept Jesus as historical. All right. And so that's why Paul says these are some of the most important facts. Because first of all, Jesus was crucified. Okay. That's Christianity. Christianity is the fact that there's a God who became man through Jesus and was crucified, buried, resurrected, and appeared so that we can one day be with him in heaven. That's Christianity. And those are all factual statements. Now, the fact that he was crucified is historical. The fact that he was buried is historical. The fact that he was raised. Now, if you don't believe in God, you're going to have a problem with that. You're going to be like, how can somebody come from who was dead come back alive? But even if, let's put that aside for a second. Even if you don't believe in God, the fact that his body was missing is historical. And the fact that he appeared to many Christians and they testified of his appearance is historical. And so how do you explain somebody who is dead coming back to life? Well, we already established that God exists over here. You see, we already established that. And so once you know that there's a God who made everything, it's easy for you to understand how that God can cause a resurrection. Because if he can create life in the first place from non-material sources, it's easy for him to take a fully dead person with all the body parts there and just give him life again. You see, that's an easier trick, so to speak. You see what I mean? And so the only reason people have a problem with believing that Jesus was raised from the dead is just because they don't really know that there's a God. But once you realize that God exists and his existence is undeniable, it's impossible for him not to exist because the other options don't make any sense, then you know, okay, there is a God. There is a spirit who created us. That spirit had the ability to create the whole universe, including all human life. It's not going to be hard for that spirit to cause a dead person to come back alive. And so that's why these are some of the most important facts. And so like when you take this whole thing together, the fact that God exists and the fact that Jesus is God in the flesh who came to die, he was crucified, he was buried, historically speaking, his body was found in the tomb was found empty, historically speaking. And Christianity started to blow up because people were claiming that they saw him. And this is all historical, verified by a number of historians that are not even Christian. What does all of that mean? It means that Christianity is not a faith, it's a fact. And you can put your faith in those facts about the things that we don't yet understand. That's where faith comes in. You see, so for example, God tells us that in the future, there's a place called heaven that whoever asks for forgiveness, if you ask him to forgive you, he says you'll be in heaven one day and you'll be able to see him. We never been there before. So that's where our faith comes in, because we've never been there. But the fact that God exists and that he came to earth in the form of Jesus and died for our sins, those are facts. And so the only place our faith comes in is after we understand these facts, we now put our faith in what he tells us with regards to our future. So faith follows facts. You can't have faith in a God who doesn't exist. So faith follows the facts that God exists. It's because there is a God that we can put our faith in him. If he didn't exist in the first place, you can't put your faith in someone who doesn't exist. So Christianity is not a faith in that sense. Christianity is a fact that serves as the foundation for our faith in things that we do not understand.